Welcome to the Gilded Age and Progressive Era, a podcast about the United States and the world in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. I'm your host, Michael Patrick Cullinane. Welcome back to the show. There are many American philosophers of the 19th century, and we might think of, say, William James, one of the founding voices of psychology and a Harvard professor. And there's also Charlotte Perkins Gilman, a social reformer and a eugenicist. And one of my favorites is John Dewey, co-founder of the New School and created the idea of reflective thinking. Of course, there are many more I could mention as well, some of which we've already covered in the show, but if we measure the reach of a philosophical idea by the number of books sold, one thinker would outsell James, Dewey, and Gilman. And if we measure the reach of a philosophical idea, one thinker would have global appeal. And yet most Americans have probably never read his most popular book or even know his name. If you're a student of the Gilded Age and Progressive Era, you'll know who I'm talking about. It's Henry George. He wrote the best-selling Progress and Poverty, and his big idea was the single tax idea based on land value. Now, to be fair, Henry George wasn't the first to come up with the idea of a value tax or a land value tax. He mentions the Romans in his book, that they had a land tax, and the idea has been doing the rounds well before the 19th century. However, the reason why George's 1881 publication of Progress and Poverty became such a hit is because industrial capitalism had transformed the world. The migration of people from farms to cities transformed where and how we live. The factory system transformed the way we work. Industries like railroads and telegraphy changed the way that markets operated, including the real estate market. George proposed a tax system that would bring equity to the industrialized world and restore democracy while preserving capitalism. It's a utopian promise, and it's mighty confusing because George was not a socialist, yet he called his plan land nationalization. And he also advocated for the working class, and he even referred to it as a class conflict. So he wasn't a socialist, right? Is he a liberal? Is he a progressive? My guest today is Dr. Christopher William England, who has written an intellectual biography on George, Georgism, and the way he fits into the genealogy of liberal thinkers. Chris is a lecturer at Georgetown University, and the name of his book is Land and Liberty, Henry George and the Crafting of Modern Liberalism. Now, I have a million questions I could ask Chris on this topic, not least because I think George has an incredible relevance for us today. If you're a millennial or a Gen Zer, or simply an academic that has been on precarious contracts forever, if you're any of those, it's likely that housing has become unaffordable. Well, George offers us answers how we might fix the property market, although many of those ideas that he has are untested and he has plenty of critics. For example, if you are a baby boomer or you own multiple properties, the idea of a tax upon the land you own will make you see red. So it's divisive, for sure, but it's certainly worth talking about. Welcome to the show, Chris.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, I think this book couldn't come at a better time. Not only are we rethinking political philosophies at the moment, but it seems like with the housing crisis around the world, or at least the Western world, Henry George is going to be more important than ever. So I thought I would start off with just who is Henry George? And what I really mean here is, can you give us a little bit of the backstory before we turn to his economic ideas?
Yeah, so Henry George comes from a pretty modest upbringing. He is from a working class family in Philadelphia. He leaves school quite early at the age of 14. Sometimes this has been interpreted as him being an anti-intellectual, but according to some accounts, he was actually very sheltered, and his doctor told him he needed to go out into the world or he was going to get sick. Either way, he ends up becoming a sailor, travels around the world, goes to India and Australia, spends some time hopping about as an artisan, mostly working in the printing trade. Eventually, he heads out west in hopes of, making it big. He struggles for a while in San Francisco in the printing trade, also for a while in Victoria, British Columbia. Ultimately, he breaks into journalism in San Francisco. And at the time, he becomes preoccupied with this question of, San Francisco is a booming city. It's beginning to grow and develop. And during this period, many people imagine that, they're boosters who think that this development is going to make everyone rich. And George thinks that isn't happening. And he famously speculates that when the Transcontinental Railroad is completed, the majority of San Franciscans will be poorer than they were before, and that it will only create more inequality. And so he struggles with answering why this is, and he ultimately comes to the conclusion that it's because of rising rents, rising land values. He argues that land is finite, and that as cities develop, there's more demand for that finite land, and therefore more and more wealth is skewed towards those who already own property.
So that's the crux of his idea. It becomes the single tax idea, which I know we're going to talk a lot more about, and because that's the thing that your book grapples with most. But can you give us a description of how Georgism aimed to solve the problems of industrial capitalism?
Yeah. So George is, he seems in a lot of ways idiosyncratic to us today because he's halfway between a libertarian and a Marxist, or maybe a little bit of both. He believes in the total socialization of land, natural resources, certain types of natural monopolies that are predicated on the ownership of finite resources. These can include communications and transportation monopolies like railroads and telegraphs. On the other hand, he broadly believes that the market should be able to operate on its own without much government intervention. So he draws a hard line between what he sees as monopolistic natural resources and the rest of the market. And his solution to socializing land, which is the crux of his argument, is a tax. And according to classical economics, as you impose taxes on land, the value of the value of that land will decrease. And so his idea is to effectively fully socialize land by taxing it at its full rental rate. And so this means that if you were to be buying a townhouse in Baltimore and one in New York City, they would cost the same amount because the difference would be paid in rent. The advantages to purchasing a house in New York would be sort of dissipated by that tax. And so this is a tax not just on agricultural land, as a lot of people had thought of it, but a tax on sort of scarce urban space and finite resources.
And Chris, this is the only tax then, right? So the single tax would replace other forms of tax, and that would be, a sizable tax on land rents, right?
Yeah, so the idea that is that this would be a large and progressively growing tax that would fund an expansive welfare state. The singleness of it is maybe not quite as important a point, I think, as some people have believed. George does talk about potentially some other taxes, but a number of Georgists are interested in inheritance taxes as well. But in general, the idea is that land is special, and so the balance of taxation should rest on that. And maybe the state can collect revenue elsewhere, but not necessarily. The Georgists sort of vary in the degree to which they think that this should be the single tax, but they do believe in the full taxation of land values.
So this is clearly going to favor one group of society over another group, and that's the tenants and the laborers, because there's no tax suggested here from George. There's no tax on labor. That's done away with. Although, of course, at the time there wasn't an income tax. So that's interesting too. I think you brought up the question about where George fits in with the sort of people of his time. And one of the things that becomes clear in your book is that George wasn't really as radical as we might think. He's not a socialist, despite calling his program land nationalization and his clear support for labor. And I suppose even his views on class conflict. He had a lot of bourgeois friends, and you situate his thought as part of the liberal tradition. And I really want you to expand on this, because as you say, he's not a progressive either. So if he's not progressive, he's not socialist, and he's part of this liberal tradition, how does he fit in? It seems quite a complicated place for him to situate himself.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think we oftentimes have this conception of classical liberalism as being sort of tantamount to modern day libertarianism, as being, gung ho about the free market. I think a lot of historians of economic thought have pushed back on that to argue that people like Adam Smith and John Stuart Mill see a lot of inequities in the market, and they're concerned about creating a competitive marketplace. And sometimes that involves government intervention. And George is part of that tradition. He idealizes a free competitive market, but he thinks that certain institutions like landed property, railroad monopoly are standing in the way of that. And he fits quite neatly into that tradition, which in some ways makes him out of place during this period, as you have a lot of especially academic progressives who are pushing back against classical liberalism, looking to German political economy, or generally, you know, very optimistic about state power and what it can achieve in society. George is instead sort of treading a middle ground. But in that way, I argue that in a lot of ways he anticipates modern liberalism, which becomes a little, somewhat disenchanted with the, progressive idealism or progressive optimism about the state after World War One, and begins to move towards civil liberties and sort of a more balanced vision of the relationship between state and society.
Now, I'm speaking to you today from Ireland, and I love that your book starts with Michael Davitt and the Irish Land League, which, of course, in your book, you mentioned that it drew inspiration from Henry George. What's the international reach of Georgism in Ireland, in the United States, and then beyond that, too?
Yeah, it's quite broad. And I argue that that's because these issues of urban rents and resource scarcity are ubiquitous. So George finds his first audience in Ireland. He finds a very avid audience throughout Great Britain. Concentrated land ownership is a major issue in England and Scotland. And the Georgist movement there plays an important role in creating this sort of a battle over the people's budget, which is a huge constitutional crisis that sort of reshapes English government in a lot of ways. It also has influence in Germany, where a lot of municipalities establish land value taxation. Australia and New Zealand implement land value taxation. Um, Also, China. Sun Yat-sen in China becomes a hero to many Georgists. He's seen as the founder of modern China, the principal sort of ideological antagonist to the emperor, and he is drawn to Georgism, I think, because Georgism offers a view of liberalism that's more egalitarian, and so it places China potentially within this framework of liberal modernization that he wants to see it heading towards. Its reach is large, and I think there's probably a lot more than I even got to here. There's some indication that, well, like Holland, for example, establishes a system of ground rent around this time, which sounds like it's rooted in Henry George, but I was never able to establish any sort of direct connection. So yeah, I think there's a large and extensive influence, which in some ways, ironically means that he is, as an American, this nation that we see is, quintessentially conservative in a lot of ways, positing a sort of quasi-utopian socialist vision that is, captivating the world. It's not typically how we see America's place in the world, which is part of irony.
Well, I think most people, if you ask them who Henry George was, they wouldn't know. And I want
Yeah.
to talk a little bit about that later. But I also wanted to turn to that moment of epiphany that he has, because you do a great job in your book of identifying that moment. He's wandering or strolling around Oakland, thinking about the city and about the property in the Bay Area. And, not a lot has changed. I mean, the Bay Area, looking for property there is like finding hen's teeth, so
Yeah.
not a lot has changed. And you make this really compelling case in your book that brings the past and the present into relief here in some ways, because you say that the Gilded Age was really a period that was about land. And we've had so many books written about this period that talk about the Gilded Age was about order, or the Gilded Age was about rebirth, or the Gilded Age was about the nouveau riche. And you say in your book, the Gilded Age was about land. And I wanted to give you an opportunity to expand on that.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I wouldn't push that too far. I'm giving, their view and sort of showing where this comes from. I think there's a lot happening in the Gilded Age. I wouldn't want to reduce it. But yeah, there are a lot of ways in which land is essential to the political economy of the period. Most of the monopolies in the period are rooted in, natural resources, steel, oil, and a lot of times this is possible precisely because someone like Carnegie comes along and he buys up, the Wasabi Mountain Range. And so it's the fact that resources are rooted in a particular location. They are exclusive and finite, that allows these monopolies to develop. The same is also largely true, I think, for railroads and telegraphs, because the thing that makes those networks so difficult to create is the networks of contiguous lands that allow for you to draw lines between major metropolitan areas. Those are very difficult to establish. They usually involve state intervention at some point, but once that assistance has been provided, there's no way to really cobble that together again. A great example is telegraphy, where Western Union doesn't have the best patents for telegraphs, but what it Sibley does is he sort of pioneers the technique of negotiating with railroads for exclusive access to rights of way. So in a lot of ways, land monopoly is the more sort of essential element to establishing this sort of corporate power, and the power of the telegraph is gigantic. Than is legal technological monopoly rooted in patents.
I know you don't want to reduce it because you're a good historian, but I have to say, it's
Thank
a
you. I
pretty
appreciate
compelling
that.
case. I mean,
Yeah.
when we think about migration in the Gilded Age, we're talking about land too, people moving off land and into places like cities. And that's another thing that I really wanted to talk to you about after reading the book, was that George really offers us a lot for contemporary economics of a city. Like the land nationalization idea that he has speaks to the value of our cities. And in a way, the progress part of Poverty and Progress, or Progress and Poverty, is about our cities. It's about the promise of population density, and it repeats that promise through democracy as a balance to the capitalist system of private ownership. So I'm just wondering if you could say something about the way George viewed our cities, not as these cesspools of vice and crime and all the things that we know that are wrong with cities, poor sanitation, but really as the centers for innovation and for change and for new ideas.
Yeah, that's a good point. And in some ways, it's surprising because the anti-urban undertones of this period are enormous. Cities are associated with corruption. They're associated with lots and lots of poop and sanitation issues.
Right. Straight. Yeah.
They generally seem like pretty unseemly places to live. But George and many of his followers are drawn to them as a place of socialization. George talks about cities as places where the greatest minds assemble, where there are opportunities for specialization, where there are opportunities for retail. Where you can have development of a consumer society where it's easier to access consumers and easier to access goods. Um, the there is an economic component to the cities in terms of economies of scale and agglomeration that's important to creating the value of this land. But he looks a little bit deeper and says that there's a social, cultural, and educational component too. And so George has often looked to cities as the center of democracy. Famously, Frederick Howe calls cities the hope of democracy. And You have George's followers like Tom Johnson in Cleveland establishing these very sort of democratic regimes where, Tom Johnson opens up the park so people can go out and commune on them rather than just look at them from a distance. He brings out his big tent and holds tent meetings and allows his constituents to just ask questions of him directly. Um, and yeah, so there's a faith, a belief in sort of a higher social value in cities that sort of underlies a lot of these ideas.
You brought up Tom Johnson. I think this is a good opportunity for us to delve a little bit more into that, because we've talked a lot about the idea of Georgism, and I don't want to depart from that because I think there's still more to unpick. But seeing as we're talking about Tom Johnson, he's the mayor of Cleveland. He's not originally the mayor of Cleveland, but tell us a little bit about his background and a little bit then about the land value tax, which is Georgism in action in an American city.
Tom Johnson is, he's an orphan initially. He comes from a family of Southerners who were ruined by the Civil War. He moves north. He eventually becomes a traction line owner. He gets into business. He runs the very streetcars that George is railing against. And then at some point, someone on the bus says, "Hey, why don't you read this Henry George book, Social Problems?" And he's sort of coaxed into doing it, and so he reads it, and he finds the issues in there unanswerable. And he even hires his lawyers to read Progress and Poverty and try to identify the holes in it, which they're unable to do. And I think that this is in part a reflection of the way in which George, as a liberal, is speaking to the values of the middle class, right? If you weren't coming in with those values, you might have objections, but he's speaking directly to people like Tom Johnson, to middle class Americans. And Johnson's unable to answer those charges. So he eventually goes to George. He becomes an acolyte. He helps organize one of his mayoral campaigns. And then he himself goes into politics, first as a congressman and then as mayor of Cleveland. And as the mayor of Cleveland, he comes to be, he's immortalized by the muckraker Leakin Steffens as, the best mayor of the best governed city in the country. He becomes an icon to reformers, not only through the Progressive Era, but into the New Deal. He does this through some very splashy fights, very, very dramatic fights with streetcar lines and railroads, and by assembling a coterie of very able lieutenants who work for him, and many of them go on to work in the Wilson administration. He becomes a model for a certain type of Georgist municipal official that spreads throughout the country during this period. And you have a growing movement in cities, either to land value taxation or to imitate Johnson's programs more broadly. But I argue that this plays an important role in the politics of the period, insofar as it draws a lot of urban Republicans into the Democratic Party.
And how successful is it in Cleveland? I mean, he introduces the land value tax. Does it work?
Well, so that's a good question. In general, Cleveland is seen as an exemplar of municipal governance, doubling the amount of roads and infrastructure that it has during his period in office. Land value taxation, it's initially shot down by its state governments interrupt land value taxation. After he leaves office, his supporters are able to get it through. There are people who've looked at changes in taxation in places like New York City during this period that emphasize land taxation and have argued that it promoted growth. I know definitely the New York case, which New York is under a Georgia's tax assessor for about a decade during this period. there's a sense that those policies are promoting growth. They're laying the foundation for the development of a lot of the urban infrastructure during the period. I think in many cases, there's a sense that land values actually go up for a little while because of the development that's spurred, but then sometimes they tank as development sort of exceeds demand. A good example is Vancouver. Vancouver becomes sort of the quintessential single tax city of North America, and during the period, there's rapid growth, some of which is can be attributed to the fact that the coast in general is developing. But most observers think that land value taxation has contributed to it. And initially, land values continue to go up, but by the 1920s, property owners are complaining that there's more housing than there are people to fill it, and there's no money to be made in land. So I think in the long run, it probably did accomplish what its supporters wanted, but that's not necessarily what everyone wanted. A lot of people were upset to see their property lose value.
Right, of course, and that's the other side of this coin is that obviously, as you say, it appeals to the middle class, it appeals to the laboring class, it appeals to those that don't own land. The other thing that your book obviously grapples with is George himself and his foray into politics. He runs for mayor of New York City twice, once against Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt finished third. George pipped him to the post, getting second place, but he never wins. I mean, can you tell us about his own place in politics? Because he's not a natural politician, is he?
No, he is seen as a great orator. He's speaking around the city, 5 or 6 times a day, drawing massive crowds. But I think more than ability or the question is inclination, right? He's sort of drafted into the New York mayoral campaign by labor unions who want him to sort of stop strike breaking and move the city in a more liberal direction. But he sees a lot of risk in this because he understands that as mayor, he doesn't have the power to implement most of his ideas. And as the head of this movement, if he's elected mayor and is unable to achieve his ends, he sort of discredits the movement. Tammany famously tells him that you won't be able to win. You'll just cause trouble. To which he delightfully replies, "Good. I don't want to win. I just want to raise hell." And so, to that effect, he sort of serves his purpose. He does manage to bring enormous national attention to his campaign because New York is, this is a period before when federal government is as important as it is. New York City is a major political entity. People around the country are looking at the race. A lot of people around the country are imitating George in local elections. So he brings a lot of attention to his cause, and afterwards parlays it into a campaign for the secret ballot, which is quite effective.
So okay, so George obviously he's got his the theory and the practice, right? And we've covered a little bit about his political runs. I want to return to the theory because this is where your book does such an amazing job of bringing the context into clearer relief. So social Darwinism features prominently, and Herbert Spencer, but also you introduce economic thinkers like Malthus and Ricardo. Social Darwinism kind of comes of age in parallel with Georgism, but they have really contrasting views on social hierarchies. Well, one has a view of social hierarchy, the other one, Georgism doesn't believe in a hierarchy. So how does George combat the popular philosophies of people like Herbert Spencer who are advocating that social Darwinist view of society?
Yeah, so I would argue that the entire sort of structure of Progress and Poverty as a book is in large ways a refutation of Herbert Spencer, because Herbert Spencer, in a lot of ways, his ideas would resonate today. He's a sort of a technological futurist. He believes that society is moving in a direction ever forward because of certain basic sort of laws of social evolution. He also believes in biological evolution and in the importance of human difference. Racial difference is a very important part of his ideas. And George, in Progress and Poverty, he tries to chart out a different perspective and show that, in fact, civilizations have come and gone. Progress has often receded. And he argues that the essence of progress, what has created progress in the past, was social equality and political equality. And that if you allow the sort of Spencerian evolution, which emphasizes hierarchy and social control to evolve, then you're actually going to see social decline rather than social progress.
It seems like he's an anti-modernist in that regard. Is that fair to say?
People like Christopher Lasch have pointed to George as, this sort of critic of progress. It's not quite fair to say that he's a critic of progress because it is all about, his ideas are all about obtaining progress, but he believes that it's not inevitable. And technology is not in and of itself going to pave the way. He has this great line where he says, yes, technology has given us the steam engine. It's also given us nitroglycerin and dynamite. And this is an observation that I think most people were not conscious of for many years. But they, of course, become eminently conscious of it in World War I, World War II, and the Cold War. And so I think he's not anti-progress, but he has a healthy skepticism that technology, absent good governance, is going to pave the way to a brighter future.
Yeah, that good governance element of it. I mean, there's a social gospel philosophy to Georgism here as well, which you do write about. Can you explain a little bit about how George saw salvation as something that was possible with a single tax, and perhaps maybe we need to include a little bit about religion here too, Catholicism in particular, who they were very threatened by Georgism. But that's two questions almost. One about the sort of social gospel of Georgism, and then the other one about religion and Catholicism particularly.
Yeah. George, he has an evangelical background. Um, he flirts with kind of spiritualism like Swedenborgianism, transcendentalist ideas. He comes back around to evangelicalism, but he maintains a certain kind of ecumenicalism. He, like many transcendentalists, he sees all religions as sort of being formed around certain core essential truths. Um, and he thinks that all of them are valid in different types of ways, which I think is important to his appeal, and as we'll get to. But also as an evangelical, he sees salvation as important, and whereas many earlier generations of religious reformers, like abolitionists, had looked to religious and personal reform to create social reform, George reverts that narrative. So, someone like William Lloyd Garrison, he didn't really believe in the federal government abolishing slavery. He believed in people being converted to Christianity and moralism and voluntarily giving up slavery. George, on the other hand, sees that an unequal society can create immorality. He himself has, at one point, almost robbed a man because he didn't have money to feed his child. And so he realizes that this society can make people immoral, can lead people away from salvation. So George flips this historical equation and he argues that we need economic reform to create a condition in which people can be moral and can obtain salvation, which sort of paves the way in some ways for the ideas of someone like Walter Rauschenbusch, who would cite George as a major influence. Um, it's even been suggested that the term social gospel was originally intended to apply to Progress and Poverty, as the book itself. At the same time, George is ecumenical, so he's making appeals to Judaism, for example, that are very influential. He manages to build a large Jewish constituency in part by appealing to the Mosaic Law of the Jubilee, which says that land needs to be redistributed every 50 years. And he argues that the single tax is the way to modernize that sort of practice. He's also citing Hinduism a lot. George visited India as a young man, as a sailor, and I think was always sort of influenced by that experience.
And his conflict with the Catholic Church is largely due to their expansive land holding around the world, right?
Well, so that's a good question. George has a large following of particularly Irish Catholics who see land as central to the question of colonization and the development of independence. And, he has a particularly sort of charismatic and popular priest on his side named Edward McGlynn. And, McGlynn's able to sort of create this sort of Catholic social justice movement in New York that rallies a lot of people to George's campaign in 1886. After that campaign, conservatives in the American Catholic Church sort of target McGlynn. He's called to Rome and he refuses to go, and so he's excommunicated, and there's this whole drawn-out battle about that. And there's discussion within the Catholic Church as to whether or not the church hierarchy should explicitly denounce Georgism. There's some indication that maybe they think that would only bring more attention to the issue. Ultimately, in Rerum Novarum, which is the sort of foundational doctrine in Catholic economic thought, the church establishes that land and capital, land and property are sacrosanct. And so this is seen, and it very possibly is, as a way of covertly invalidating George's ideas and saying that Georgism is not part of Catholic doctrine. McGlynn and other Georgists very shyly shift focus here, and this is partially when and maybe why they start to talk about a single tax. They begin to say we're not actually abolishing property and land, we're just taxing it. And so this is a way to try to reconcile their ideas with the Catholic Church, and I think it's at least partially successful. And it's also part of a long, drawn-out story of how Georgists are pitching their ideas quite subtly, and they're adept in their sort of political rhetoric and often covering their ground. They're very calculating.
Well, they're political, I guess. They've got, and
Yeah.
if nothing else, the Catholic Church is political.
Yeah.
And obviously there's the emphasis of Georgism is around the cities. But I thought what your book did really well too was it took the idea of federal land leasing beyond just the sort of places where the railroads were going. It took us to the rural parts. It took us west of the Mississippi, including Native American territory, and the way Georgism left a mark on conservation policies. So tell us a little bit more about Georgism out west, and Georgism particularly among Native American communities.
Most Georgists realize that the best way to implement their ideas on the federal level is not as a tax, but to take land that the government already owns and begin leasing it. And so they begin this push towards federal leasing of resource land, which is, of course, the system that we have today. If you want oil on public land, you lease it from the federal government. You don't purchase the land permanently. And they lay the foundation for that. They also see a possibility in American Indian policy, because indigenous people have historically, owned land collectively. And there's a sense that privatization did not work out very well for them. It led to the alienation of much of their land. And the question of privatization has always been, in interesting ways, sort of tied up with George's policy. Dawes, who proposes the Dawes Act that privatizes land, he visits indigenous land and he says, "This is the Henry George system." indigenous people, in their arguments against privatization, sometimes reference Henry George. I think precisely because they want to indicate to white America, hey, maybe idea isn't working out too well for you. Yeah, look what your own people are saying about this. Um, internally in indigenous publications, they often reference the same ideas of land value taxation. The chief of the Cherokee is arguing for land value taxation at the same time that, on the same day that Henry George is being elected or running for mayor in New York. But he doesn't explicitly reference George. And I think that, internally, there's an inclination not to say, hey, we're getting these ideas for collective ownership from white people because we've had this forever. This is an idea that sort of runs parallel with indigenous ideas. And it's something that tribal governments are engaging with to sort of try to secure traditional ways of living.
Fascinating. The reach of Georgism. I mean, we've only scratched the surface here with the domestic and international. I mean, I think you'll have to read the book to get a little bit deeper into it. But I want to just bring us to the present day, because if Georgism had its proponents in its own time, certainly has more people thinking about him nowadays. I think it probably speaks mostly to the millennial and the Gen Z folks that can't afford a home. But George still kind of remains a peripheral figure in public consciousness today. We might talk about some other land value ideas, but Georgism itself is fairly peripheral. Why do you think that is?
So, I argue at the end of the book that you have, the New Deal is also very invested in land and natural resource policy, and it sees it as a vital axis for economic inequality. But it goes a very different direction than Henry George in many respects, in that instead of trying to nationalize land, it tries to subsidize private ownership. And the liberal state from the 1930s to the 1960s invests heavily in developing a suburban culture in which it's easier for individuals to purchase their own houses, and in which it's easier to leave cities and sort of leave this sort of nexus of inequality that's created by scarce space. Henry George talked about this in Progress and Poverty, that there is this potential, right, that you could take this other trajectory of trying to shore up individual land ownership, but his argument was that eventually you run out of space. You can only do that for so long, and I think we've maybe finally hit that point where I think most major metropolitan areas are more sprawling than is sustainable, especially with higher fuel prices. And so you're seeing a move back towards the cities. You're seeing more scarcity in space. And so these issues that lost relevance for a long time have suddenly become relevant again. When I began this book, I just thought that George was a strange figure that was going to illustrate why the Gilded Age was weird. And then as I was writing it, suddenly it became a thing that people were very vitally interested in. And that's because I think the issues that he was writing about have become increasingly important over a period of years. And so you've had, increasing interest in the issue from especially young urbanites who can't purchase property. In many ways, they're the analogs of the people that George was speaking to back in the day. There's a strong, contingent of people in tech who are interested in these ideas, who mirror the knowledge workers and middle class artisans that that were drawn to the movement way back when. So it's funny to see, the parallels and the consistency. I don't know where we're going. It's hard to say if this will develop more momentum, and maybe we'll see it become a less peripheral issue. But it's certainly been brought back to life by changing economic conditions. I will also say that I think that, one difference is that today a lot of Georgists are economists. I think not very many people who are publicly associated with the idea, myself included, are the sort of populist rabble rousers that George was. I don't know that there are many people today who can really kind of speak to ethical issues and really draw on people's feelings the way that George did.
Yeah, I think I would argue too that economists have changed perhaps as well. They're not. One of the things in your book points out is that a lot of the economists of his time were quite. I suppose they saw George as not being formally trained, and therefore he couldn't really speak with any authority to these issues. Whereas nowadays, economists think, well, everyone can speak to the conditions of our political economy, and that's a big change. But maybe if we turn the whole "why is George peripheral" on its head, and we think about the vested interests that are opposed to Georgism. I talked about millennials and Gen Z being of that class. You call them tech laborers, but that class of person has an opposite class in the baby boomer generation, which do own a lot of land, especially in the United States. Are they the critics? Are they the ones that are saying we couldn't have a single tax because it will collapse the economy, it'll ruin property ownership in the country? What I mean is that what the critics of Georgism say?
Yeah, so at the time, the critics were largely farmers, and George tried to appeal to farmers. It didn't work very well, and it's a large part of why the movement was often centralized in cities because politically it didn't have any reach in rural areas where people actually own land. I looked at an article in more depth at Vancouver, where this idea is realized more so than in many other places, and one of the funny things about the debate over it in the 1930s is that everyone's sort of in agreement as to what's happening. It's just a question of whether or not they like it. The critics of land value taxation are saying that my property isn't worth anything. There's too much built up. Rents are too low. I can't turn a profit. But the issue now is that if it has been successful in making property more available, more people have property, and there are fewer people who are tenants who have high rents and are particularly concerned about it. And so the underlying sort of paradox of Georgia's politics, and I think that this is maybe an issue with a lot of social welfare politics, is that if it works, it's no longer an issue that people feel like addressing. It's just maybe a little bit more of an issue with Georgism than a lot of other issues because you're dealing with a tax that people don't like to pay. And so inherently, you're always going to have, you know, uh, pronounced opposition, but you're not going to necessarily have consistent support if it does what it's supposed to do.
Well, if you could scrap the income tax and bring in a property tax or a land value tax, that might have some appeal for some people today. Certainly, the number of taxes that have proliferated, sales tax, and there's talks about changing the tax code all the time. I think it might be worth thinking about Henry George a little bit more in our current context. And look, this is unfair of me, and this is the last question that I'll pose to you. What do you think? I mean, you've read more about Henry George than most people. Would Georgism work then and now?
Certainly, to some degree, I mean, there are places in the world where this idea has kind of been implemented. Hong Kong has nationalized land. A lot of the East Asian tigers have, to various degrees, extensive government ownership or land value taxation. Taiwan has land value taxation. Singapore has government government built housing, and it's obviously helped pave the way for very successful economies in those places. It's unlikely that you could have a single tax nowadays. I don't think so. I mean, I could be wrong. There are Australian economists who've looked at this issue a little bit more broadly and looked at other types of finite property like domain names, broadband networks, and have done the math to show that if you could have a tax that just taxed monopoly without income, So I mean that's I can't check those numbers, but it's conceivable. Likely, it's a policy that can be pretty successful. I'm not sure it can do everything George imagines. I'm not sure that it would necessarily be able to create, for example, the perfect republic that he imagines would be created, where everyone is an enlightened citizen. But it is, broadly speaking, decent policy. Some sort of land value taxation or confiscation of resource values is, I think, effective at creating a more efficient economy, an economy that's more equitable, and sort of allowing for easy ways to fund sort of a social welfare state without impinging upon enterprise, which is a vital concern nowadays when you have globalization and you're always concerned about sort of the detrimental impacts of economic policy on actors and how that will impact national sort of performance on international competition.
Yeah, that does seem to be the wild card in all this. I like Tom Johnson's gathering of lawyers and other people within a sort of city administration to say disprove that. It almost has like a Karl Popper feel to it, where you say the more you try and disprove something and you can't, the more true it is. So I don't know. For me, I'd like to see a little bit more experimentation. Although I am also, cards on the table, not a utopian, and not I wouldn't be naive to think that this would change anything. It's fascinating, though, Chris. I can't thank you enough for joining the show because Henry George is a towering figure. He's one of the most well-known people of his time, and he seems to be someone that is relatively forgotten, I suppose, in our own age. So I encourage people to pick up Land and Liberty, Henry George, and the Crafting of Modern Liberalism. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Well, that's all we have time for. Thanks for listening. You can follow the Gilded Age and Progressive Era on Twitter or on my website, michaelpatrickcullinane.com. Please consider subscribing or reviewing the podcast wherever you listen, because it really makes a big difference and helps direct others to the show. I hope you'll join me again for the next episode.